Bismillah. Alhamdulillah. Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. To my friends and my brothers, the few of them hiding in the back, finally knowing what it feels like to be in the back. To my aunties and my nieces and my sisters and my daughters and my friends, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I feel both ill-equipped, out of place, but also honored to be in your presence and to be talking about this very important reality. I'm actually thankful that the organizers who invited me here told me that I was to be on a panel and was not supposed to prepare any remarks. And I'm thankful that they did that, because I walked in here kind of an empty canvas. And I've been very lucky and very fortunate to be colored by and to be painted by the beautiful and insightful and wise words of these very strong, noble women. And by your presence and by what Allah has brought about in this moment. And I'm thankful to be able to be in this space and to be inspired by your presence. And I think the metaphor of the rock and the maggots is a very fitting one, because as we begin to move this mountain of a rock, of this question of our sisters and our women in our community, there are many maggots that appear. One of them that I think our community is not honest enough about is our failure to address the rights and the status of women in the Muslim community and how that relates to combating or responding to Islamophobia. Because so many people, both men and women in the broader society, as they critique Islam, albeit often from an ill-informed place, one of the key questions that is asked, sometimes verbally, sometimes non-verbally, is what's up with women in Islam? So we want to respond to Islamophobia on the socio-political stage, but I think are not honest enough about how important it is that we address this question and we do our kind of own housekeeping, so to speak. I'm thankful for the permission given, frankly, by the remarks of all of those who've spoken before me, and particularly by Sayyida Humera's emphasis on us working together, because I think that is very important. And I think that one of the problems in our situation is that the men don't see enough importance on addressing the status and addressing the mistreatment and addressing the problems surrounding our women, and that the men don't realize that they will not be well, and that their children will not be well, and the society, the ummah, the community will not be well if our women are not well. And we pray that Allah bring about healing and bring about, inshallah, solutions in our community. I also appreciate the idea of accountability that was brought up. And frankly, I come from a community where that accountability still lies and still applies and still remains. And so the question, for example, of domestic violence, that is a far more prevalent crime in our community than we're honest about, or the crime of sexual abuse, which is a far more prevalent crime in our community than we're honest about, is one where in certain communities it would be addressed probably long before the police heard anything about it. But that's only when you have a community where men are truly being men. So if we're not accountable to one another, and we're not accountable to the law enforcement, we're not really accountable to anybody. And one of the things I've found when I've attempted on the multiple occasions to intervene in situations where there was domestic violence is that Muslims are often afraid to call the police, and they're told things like, well, don't involve the kuffar, or oftentimes the sister unfortunately enables the person who's beating her because she's afraid to be exposed, or the shame and all of these things that happen. Having said all of that, there was a quote by a famous author, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and he's speaking about the state of African American people, but I think it's relevant here, and I find the quote relevant, frankly, to most of what we have to talk about as Muslims living in the West. And he said that the question of race doesn't enter here, but it is rather a question of approaching people through their environment as it is, not as you imagine it to be or would like to see it. And I think that that's relevant because so often when we talk about women in Islam, and reference, for example, the hadith of paradise being at the feet of the mother, or the multitude of references about the status of women in Islam that are positive, I think we often, from that place, spiritually bypass a lot of the problems and kind of don't really address the very real ills that are happening, so we avoid approaching the environment as it is. On a lighter note, I remember a friend of mine, because this is like the first hadith, obviously you tell your mother, right? You learn this hadith and talk about paradise lying at the feet of your mother. So a friend of mine told his mom this hadith, and sometime later he decided that he wanted to go to learn Arabic in the Arabic-speaking world, and so he asked his mother permission to go to Cairo. And she says, honey, didn't you tell me that paradise lies at the feet of your mother? And he said, yes. She said, baby, why do you want to go all the way to Cairo and leave paradise? So you have to be careful teaching. Or my son, he gave my wife something a couple months ago, and he didn't give me one. I said, why didn't you give me one? He says, your mother, then your father. No more hadith for you. So considering that we need to approach things as they are, I'd like to provide, and again, I do so while recognizing that I'm ill-equipped and while recognizing that I'm not, as a man, I'm not the one who's supposed to be addressing women's issues, and I hope that you believe me when I say that I'm speaking as a father, as a husband, as a brother, and as a servant to the ladies in our community. So I hope that this does not come off as patriarchal, because that would obviously be not the right place to be patriarchal, or time, or ever for that matter. But I'd like to propose, and perhaps this can feed our conversation that I hope is forthcoming. You all know the difference between Freud and Maslow. Freud, who obviously informs much of modern psychology, and our sister who works as a counselor is probably well aware of the fact that Freud develops his psychology based off of treating his patients. So he develops his philosophy, he develops his approach to psychology off of seeing people who were ill. And so the emphasis on repressed emotions, the emphasis on repression, and frankly much of Freud's psychology is based off of looking at a situation where people are ill. Maslow, and I'm not subscribing to either of their philosophies per se, but rather just using it as a framework, Maslow, in response to Freud, critiques that, saying that it actually presents a problem that Freud's approach to psychology was based off of only looking at ill people, because in order to actually attain mental wellness, and you could apply here or insert here social wellness, that you actually have to look at models of health. And you have to also look at what health looks like. Because if you're constantly defining yourselves against illness, then you're inevitably going to perpetuate that illness. And I think that as a community, both relating to the issues of women in our community, but I think this applies to converts, to da'wah, to community, in general, we have to be careful of taking a Freudian approach to addressing the issues in our community. Let me be clear that I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about the maggots under the rock. I'm not saying we shouldn't move the rock. I'm saying we should move the rock, look at the maggots, be honest about the fact that they're ugly as maggots, and then develop a Maslowian kind of hierarchy of priorities, as it were. So Maslow has his hierarchy of needs that you know well about, but I think that we need to develop a hierarchy of priorities. Naturally, as it pertains to issues of women in our community, this should first and foremost be for the women and by the women. And I say that to say that men have to be very careful of superimposing or forcing their interpretation of what women need onto the women in the community. And women have to feel empowered and have to feel that they have the right to self-define and to self-authenticate from within the Muslim tradition, not from without, in order for them to be well, in order for us as a community to be well. I think if we're honest about some of the critical issues, and if we were to begin thinking about some of the possible things that could go into a hierarchy of priorities vis-a-vis women in Islam, I do believe, as was hinted, and I take permission from the ladies who spoke before me, to cite that educational and spiritual cultivation is at the top of those priorities. The Arabs say the mother is a madrasa. She is a school in and of herself. So if you elevate her, you will elevate an erudite society. If we don't elevate the women, and if the women are not taught, and if we as men do not empower our women to be learned in the Muslim tradition and learned in conventional wisdom, we ultimately are the ones who suffer, our children suffer, and by extension the community suffers. And I think we all know that, and luckily we're in a society where hopefully people have adequate access to education. Having said that, I think it's important that women are able to have women teachers. My noble sister, she talked about the men of Tasawwuf, because that's a well-known and oft-repeated idea, that the men of Tasawwuf. But when we think about our scholars, when we think about people of knowledge in Islam, we tend to almost always talk about and think about and operate with those people being men. And I can't help but imagine that just like I'm able to have a very intimate, honest, and close relationship with my teachers, not only in terms of the conversations that are had, but also the importance of having basic, healthy human touch, being able to shake their hands and learn in a space that is intimate and that is comforting, that I think women also need that. And given the realities of the gender kind of guidelines in Islam, I think it's important that we develop not just women scholars who can be tokenistic representatives on panels or those type of things, not saying that that's what this is at all, but you find this often, right? Conferences happen and it's like, well, we better put a woman up there. Why? Because we want to get fed when we go home tonight. We don't want our luggage to be on the doorstep. So let's find a sister. And as long as she can just say a few words and then get us out of trouble, that's fine. Moving beyond that and actually developing realized, authoritative women scholars. And I think this is very important. Imam al-Shafi'i, as you know, studied with the noble lady Sayyidah Nafisa. And she, when Imam al-Shafi'i would go to her, she would say certain prayers for him. And one time when he went not long before his passing, she said a different prayer than she usually said, and he took that as a foretelling of his passing. When Imam al-Shafi'i passed, and as you know, Imam al-Shafi'i was one of the great legal scholars of Islam. When he passed, the news was given to Sayyidah Nafisa, who said, Rahimullahu Muhammadan ibn Idris al-Shafi'i kana rajulan yuhsin al-wudu. She said, may Allah have mercy on Muhammad, the son of Idris al-Shafi'i. He was a man who made good wudu. You guys don't get it. He was a man who made good wudu. In other words, from her lofty place as his teacher, what she had to say about it, which wasn't a low thing, but it's to say, we know Imam al-Shafi'i because of his great legal prowess and because of his great stature as a scholar. She was saying, mashallah, the brother made good wudu. And so, having had the honor of studying with women scholars, as a man, I can't help but imagine that it's very important for our sisters to have that opportunity, and pray from my heart that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring about in this community and in the global community a plethora and a multitude of qualified, authoritative, realized women scholars. Ameen. Another thing that I think is possible for a hierarchy of priorities is meaningfully addressing the social needs of the women in our community. And I think at the forefront of that is this idea of healthy sense of self and self-authentication, and making sure that women feel not only validated, but feel valued and feel loved. And I don't want my daughters to grow up in a Muslim community where they're always kind of, an afterthought. And I can't help but agitate, and lest I never be invited back to the UK, I can't help but agitate the nature of space within Muslim sacred spaces. So often you go to places and mashallah, the men have these beautiful, mashallah, adorned, furnished, tiled, air-conditioned, perfumed prayer spaces, and then you go and look, where do the women pray? Well, there's a mop closet over there. They just kind of fit in. I remember being at a mosque in Europe, at a city that will remain unnamed. It wasn't in the UK. But I went into this mosque that had been kind of, was kind of, rehab from a church. They flipped it into a masjid. It was beautiful. I mean, there was stained glass and there was beautiful acoustics and such a beautiful prayer space. The place was so moving that I was actually moved to tears by just the sheer beauty of the place. And when the Quran was being recited, it was so beautiful. And on the way out, and then downstairs they had a tea parlor and a barber shop, and mashallah, it was so wonderful. Really deep. I was like, wow, the Muslims in America got to get their stuff together. And on our way out, he said, and this is where our women pray. And it was literally a place that had a wooden kind of stage, like it was like a wooden cage, and then aluminum siding. And it was inside the mosque. And you know, the Arabs say, Shareability ma yudhik, the worst things make you laugh, because you really have only one choice. You either laugh or cry. And I thought to myself, I actually took a picture of it, and I thought to myself, if I brought my mother here, or my sister, or my wife, or my daughter, or a friend from the community, how would I justify that the men, and the conversation is obviously what? Well, more men come than women. Chicken egg. Chicken egg. If you're going to put people in mop closets, yes, less of them are going to show up. But I can't help, and I know that I'm in the UK, and people have a certain norm, and don't ruffle feathers, but Americans have been known to do a lot more than just ruffle feathers. So that's something that we need to agitate, that the nature of space for women in the community, and I believe very strongly that the men in the community need to take that on as a priority. There was a friend of mine, an imam, who said, I want you to join me in a boycott. I said, what's your boycott? He said, I want you to join me in boycotting speaking in any mosque where there's a partition where women are not in the same space. And I said, well, first of all, I think that would be a bit culturally insensitive given the fact that that's a developed norm in so many Muslim communities. And I said, and second of all, perhaps more importantly, if we were to do that boycott, we would not have any mosque to speak in. And we wouldn't even be able to have the conversation. So I think that we need to be sensitive, creative, but all the more forthcoming and courageous in addressing that. Also, this question of mental health, you know, I think it's very noble of the sister to have observed confidentiality and to have not cited specific cases. And I think that that's important, and it shows a level of professionalism. And I think that if she were to go into cases, we'd be very shocked to hear the number of physical and often sexual abuse cases that are happening within Muslim families, and it's disproportionately there. A colleague of mine who's an imam in New York City, who you may know of, Imam Khalid Latif, who is a very dynamic young leader in Manhattan, told me that 6 different ladies came to him independent of one another in the course of a week, all of whom had been sexually abused by none other than their Quran teachers. Big problem, pink elephant, because what happens when your Quran teacher sexually molests you? You then develop trauma around reciting the Quran. And every time you go to try to recite the Quran, there's a trigger that reminds you of that abuse, of that crime that was committed against you. Very real problem in the community. And the Prophet himself said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the thing I fear most for my community are evil scholars. The thing I fear most for my community are evil scholars. And what more evil of a thing to do than to sexually abuse the very people who want to learn scripture from you? So dealing with, you know, the stuff around mental health is very, very serious. And destigmatizing people having access to therapy is also very important. I'll go out on a limb and say, I don't know of anybody alive today who's not a worthy candidate of accessing therapy. Just by way of being alive in the age that we live in, just by way of just breathing the air that we breathe, I think we all need access to therapy. People say, well, I don't need access to therapy. Hey, that might be the biggest indicator that you do need access to therapy. Huh? Yeah. Seriously. Because just by living in the time that we live in, it's a very traumatized age that we live in. So this idea of, you know, don't talk to the mental health therapist, or better yet, I would love to go to therapy, but I couldn't find a Muslim therapist. Well, then find a good non-Muslim therapist who understands and is respectful of your faith tradition, and inshallah is not some atheist who wants to secretively convince you that there's no God through therapy. But make sure that you have access to mental health services and destigmatize it. And may Allah bless you, sister, for the work that you're doing. And may He increase quantitatively and qualitatively the likes of you, Ya Rabbil Alameen, and all of these noble women. Also, I hate to be that guy, but I'll be the guy who says the marriage crisis is something we've got to talk about. Because, you know, I'm serious. The divorcee idea that, you know, she's not an option. The idea that if a sister's older than 24, young ladies come to me, students, friends in my community, they say, my parents are giving me hell. What's going on? They're saying, getting old. What do you mean? I'm 23 years old and I'm not married yet. You know, and they're really concerned. And it's like the only thing that's ever talked about at dinner, you know, at breakfast, at lunch. It's like 24/7. Every time you see your parents, when are you getting married? Well, not since we had dinner last night. That's when you know, and it becomes, and now the problem of that is this idea that we talked about conditions of worth. Because if all we're ever talking to our daughters about is whether or not they're married, we're attaching marriage as the measure of their worth. So it's a crisis. I don't have the answers for it, and I'm just saying that we definitely need to deal with it. And if somebody wanted to make that their life's work, it would be a life well spent, I believe. Also, this crisis of women who are over 25 and are not able to get married, and what ends up happening, it's a very serious thing. It's one of the things that breaks my heart. So many young, noble, intelligent, upright women in our community who are despairing and oftentimes falling into doubt about the very existence of God because they have not been able to find a spouse because the measure of their worth has been so directly and intrinsically related to this idea of marriage. It's a very, very real problem, and I pray that Allah bring about a real solution for us in the community. Finally, and I'm just presenting ideas, trying to agitate a conversation, capacity building around empowered Muslim woman leadership. And if we're honest, one of the largest mosques in the Bay Area where I live has written on their bylaws that no woman should be part of the board of this masjid. It's actually written on the bylaws. And a lady, a sister who was one of the co-founders of the organization that I serve, who's a brilliant young attorney, she was consulting them, and she said, you have to take this off of your bylaws. You could lose your 501c3 charitable status. And they said, we'll take our chances. And it remains on their bylaws now that no woman should be part of the board's leadership. And it's a serious crisis. And this is in the Silicon Valley, in California, progressive and yada yada. So I think it's a real problem around the absence of women in positions of real, not tokenistic, but real authentic positions of leadership in the Muslim community at the different levels that it necessitates. And it's a very, very real thing. I think we need to be honest about micro and macro aggression. I was at a conference just last week before I came here in Chicago, a Muslim philanthropy conference, which is a very promising group of people. And one of the people I was on a panel with was a colleague and a friend of mine who also happens to be the wife of the CFO of my organization, who herself is a founder of the Muslim Women's Alliance in Chicago. And somebody asked a question during the panel, do you all know one another? Because there's different people serving as directors or what have you of different organizations. And I said, yeah, I know everybody here. And I went on to talk about how I know everybody there. And I said, and Sister Surur is a friend of mine, and she's a great colleague, and she's also the wife of my CFO, and she makes a really great salmon with risotto. And I was just like, she makes really good salmon, mashallah, tabarakallah. And so her sister gave me, she gave me a little bit of She corrected me afterwards. She's like, really? I was like, what? She said, the one thing you're going to mention about her on this panel is that she's a good cook. And I was like, I just really like her salmon. I didn't mean anything by it. And if I had it to do over, I would not have mentioned the kitchen, let alone salmon, because we have to be clear that I didn't intend anything by that, but it can become a microaggression, where I'm subtly kind of suggesting that, yeah, I know her by way of her salmon, and I don't mention the great accomplishment she's made both in the corporate world and in the Muslim nonprofit sector. So I think we've got to be clear that there are not only macroaggressions, but also microaggressions that can impede the development of strong Muslim woman leadership. If anything I've said is good, that's by Allah. If anything I said rubbed you the wrong way, that's just because I'm not supposed to be here. I'm a guy, and I'm talking on a women's panel, and it's because of myself. But I do pray that Allah bring about in our community a real, tangible, long, impactful solutions to the different challenges that we face, Ya Rabbil Alameen. I would invite some of my young sisters who are here, or older sisters who are here, to think about the idea of developing a hierarchy of priorities for the women, by the women, that the men, inshallah, buy into and support. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us all, Ya Rabbil Alameen. I thank you all very much for your time. I'm excited to be here. Hope that the conversation is both honest and solution-oriented during the Q&A. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa alihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.